The Devil's Backbone Trail stretches across the Colorado landscape like a jagged scar carved into stone. By daylight, it is celebrated as one of the region's most breathtaking hikes, where sharp ridges meet wide skies and silence is broken only by the wind. But when the sun dips, the atmosphere shifts. Locals speak in hushed tones about strange vanishings, hikers who stepped onto the trail and were never seen again, and stories of shadows that move where no one should be. The trail has gained a reputation that is both alluring and unsettling, a place of beauty that seems to watch those who walk it. What makes the disappearances even more disturbing is that they are not distant legends or campfire tales, but real cases with real people who never returned. And tonight, we'll begin exploring the first of these stories, where ordinary adventure turned into lingering mystery, rising just outside the town of Loveland, Colorado. The Devil's Backbone Trail looks almost otherworldly. Long ridges of rock jut sharply into the sky, twisting like the spine of some ancient creature frozen in time. From a distance, the formation is striking, even majestic. Hikers are drawn here for its panoramic views, the wildflowers that blanket the foothills in spring, and the sense of standing on the edge of something both beautiful and forbidding. But beneath the tourist brochures and trail maps lies a different story, one that has been whispered by locals for decades. Some call it cursed land. Others believe it carries an energy that unsettles the mind, making hikers feel watched even when alone. Weather itself seems to play tricks here. The sky can shift without warning from bright blue to heavy cloud, and winds roar suddenly through the ridges, carrying with them strange echoes. Some hikers report hearing faint voices riding the gusts, voices that vanish as quickly as they came. Others describe footsteps crunching in the dirt behind them, only to find nothing when they look back. At dusk, the atmosphere thickens. The warm glow of the sunset paints the rocks in crimson, but instead of comfort, it often stirs unease. Silhouettes along the ridges take on strange shapes, stretching unnaturally, moving when the eye insists they should not. Those who camp nearby speak of waking in the night to see shifting lights across the cliffs, distant yet purposeful, like lanterns carried by unseen hands. Folklore has grown around these sightings. Some say the backbone was once a sacred site, a place where ancient peoples performed rituals, and that their spirits still linger. Others claim the jagged rocks mark a boundary between worlds, a place where the veil thins, and where those who linger too long risk slipping into something they cannot return from. Yet, despite the unsettling tales, the trail continues to attract hikers, photographers, and families looking for adventure. Perhaps it is the very contrast, the beauty against the unease, that gives the backbone its pull. Curiosity seems stronger than caution, and each year more people set foot on the ridges, convinced they will be safe, that the stories are exaggerations, but not all of them return. The disappearances are not the work of campfire storytellers or local legends. They are documented, investigated, and in some cases, never explained. The trail's allure seems to hide something darker beneath the surface, something waiting patiently among the rocks. And as we step closer into these accounts, the first story we encounter begins in the 1990s with a man who knew the wilderness well, a man who should have returned easily and yet never came back. In the summer of 1995, the Devil's Backbone Trail was alive with visitors. Families hiked in groups, couples paused for photographs, and solo adventurers moved along the ridges with backpacks and water bottles rattling at their sides. Among them was a man named Daniel Harper. He wasn't a beginner. In fact, Daniel was the kind of hiker people trusted to lead them through the wild. He'd grown up exploring Colorado's rugged terrain, familiar with weather shifts, wildlife, and the dangers of straying too far. On that particular weekend, he told friends he planned to hike a section of the Backbone alone. Just a few hours to clear his mind, and that he'd be back by evening. He never returned. At first, there was little reason to worry. Daniel had often taken longer than expected on hikes, pausing to sketch or photograph the scenery. But when the sun dipped low and his car remained parked at the trailhead, unease began to spread. By the next morning, search and rescue teams were combing the ridges. The search started methodically. Rescuers traced the trail, calling his name, into the canyons. They brought dogs trained to pick up scents, helicopters to scan from above, and volunteers to cover every side path. For days, they found nothing. No footprints leading away from the trail. No sign of a fall. No torn fabric caught on jagged stone. The only clue appeared on the third day. Daniel's backpack, discovered neatly placed near the edge of the ridge. Inside the pack were his water bottle, a partially eaten sandwich, and his journal. The handwriting on the last page stopped mid-sentence, as if interrupted. But what struck rescuers most was the placement of the bag. It wasn't tossed, dropped, or weather-beaten. It looked as though Daniel had set it down intentionally, planning to return for it. Yet, from that spot onward, no trace of him could be found. Rumors swirled quickly. Some believed he had wandered further off-trail and succumbed to exhaustion, or an unseen fall, voices, or figures in the rocks that drew him away. One search volunteer later claimed he felt a presence while scanning the cliffs near where the backpack was found, describing a sense of being observed. He brushed it off at the time, but admitted years later that it haunted him still, weeks past the official conclusion labeled Daniel a missing hiker, presumed dead. But the absence of evidence made it difficult for anyone to accept. His family insisted he would never have walked away from his belongings, never left his journal behind. Fellow hikers pointed out the contradictions. No signs of struggle, no indication of panic, no accident scene, just a trail that seemed to swallow a man whole. The case was eventually closed, but locals remembered, and with each retelling, Daniel's disappearance became less of a simple tragedy and more of a warning that even the most experienced can vanish on the Backbone, without reason and without trace. For many, this was the beginning of an unsettling pattern. His story was not the last. Over the years that followed, others would vanish in similarly inexplicable ways. But before diving deeper into those cases, it's important to understand what hikers themselves began to experience on the trail. Odd sounds, fleeting shadows, and whispers that made them question whether they were ever truly alone. Long after Daniel's disappearance, the Devil's Backbone developed a reputation not just for vanishing hikers, but for the strange sensations visitors reported while walking its ridges. These weren't the kind of stories one would file in police reports. With a nervous laugh, that something about the Backbone felt wrong. One of the most common claims was the sound of whispers. Not voices carried clearly, but fragmented syllables, almost like a conversation just out of reach. Some hikers described it as a faint murmur drifting on the wind. Others as a voice right behind their ear, stopping the moment they turned. What unsettled them most wasn't what was heard, but the way the sound seemed to follow, shifting direction as if it wanted to remain hidden. Then there were the footsteps. Several hikers, walking alone, spoke of hearing the distinct crunch of gravel, matching their pace. They'd stop, silence would fall, and then, after a few more steps, the sound would return. No figure was ever spotted, no tracks left behind. A trick of acoustics, perhaps, but one that left many abandoning their hikes early. Shadows were another theme. At dusk, when the rocks stretch long silhouettes across the path, some hikers claimed to see shapes moving where none should be. Not animals, not passing strangers, but human-like figures standing on ridges, watching. By the time they lifted a camera or called out, the shapes would dissolve into the stone itself. Skeptics argue that exhaustion, dehydration, and the natural eeriness of isolation can play tricks on the mind. And that's true. Our senses often betray us when the environment is unforgiving. But what makes these stories harder to dismiss is how often they overlap. Strangers who never met describe nearly identical experiences. Whispers, footsteps, watching silhouettes. Over time, the folklore grew. Locals began saying the rocks themselves were alive with memory, that voices of the lost echoed through the ridges, calling out for others to join them. Hikers were warned not to answer the whispers, not to follow them off the trail, no matter how curious they felt. The unsettling part is that many who disappeared were last reported to have acted strangely, wandering off suddenly, or stepping away from groups as if distracted by something no one else could see or hear. And while whispers and shadows might seem like harmless stories, they take on a different weight when placed alongside the very real disappearances. Because after Daniel, and after countless eerie encounters, the trail did not quiet down. In fact, its reputation only deepened when an entire group. In the early 2000s, the Devil's Backbone Trail was already carrying a reputation for odd vanishings. Locals remembered Daniel Harper's case, but most still considered it a tragic, isolated incident. That belief began to fracture when a group of friends decided to hike the Backbone on a bright Saturday morning in late spring. There were 4 of them, 2 men, 2 women, all in their mid-20s, young but capable. They packed snacks, water, and cameras, intending to spend only a few hours exploring. Their car was found later that night, parked neatly at the trailhead, keys still inside. The friends were never seen again. The initial assumption was simple. They had gotten lost, but the Backbone Trail system isn't endless. Rescue teams swept the ridges, grid by grid. Dogs were brought in, helicopters scanned from above, and volunteers spent days scouring every crevice. What unsettled searchers most was the lack of any sign at all. No discarded packs, no clothing, no footprints leading off the main path. It was as if the group had simply stepped into the air and vanished. Witnesses who had seen the group earlier in the day recalled nothing unusual. They were laughing, talking, pausing to take photos. One couple who crossed paths with them described them as cheerful and unhurried, moving at a steady pace toward the higher ridges. That was the last confirmed sighting. Rescuers reported oddities during their search. One volunteer claimed that their trained search dog refused to continue past a certain point, whining and digging its paws into the dirt as if something ahead unsettled it. Helicopter pilots reported difficulty focusing their eyes when scanning a particular section of the ridge, describing a shimmer like heat rising from asphalt, even though the air was cool. The longer the search dragged on, the more unease spread through the teams, and then there was the sound. Multiple searchers, independent of each other, spoke later about hearing laughter at night. It wasn't the kind of laughter you hear from campsites or passing hikers. It echoed strangely, thin and distorted, seeming to come from the cliffs themselves. When they moved closer to investigate, the sound stopped. When they pulled back, it returned faintly, as if mocking their efforts. Official reports never mentioned the laughter. Instead, the disappearance was filed under the same explanation that Daniel's had been. Hikers lost in rugged terrain, likely victims of accident or exposure. But privately, searchers admitted they couldn't understand how 4 people could vanish without leaving a trace. Even a fall, even an accident, would have left belongings behind. The families of the missing pressed for answers. For months, vigils were held at the trailhead. Flyers were distributed, interviews conducted, and rumors spread. Some believed the group had staged their disappearance, that they'd chosen to vanish into new lives. But those who knew them well dismissed the idea. Their wallets, phones, and personal items remained untouched in the car. Everything pointed to them intending to return. Over the years, hikers walking the backbone have reported feeling an odd heaviness near the area where the group was last seen. Some described it as a silence too deep, as if even the wind avoided that stretch of trail. And while officials eventually stopped looking, locals never forgot. It marked the moment when the backbone's reputation shifted from eerie folklore to something darker, something that seemed to grow with each disappearance. Yet, strangely, whenever questions rose about these vanishings, official voices grew quieter, hesitant to admit what so many on the ground had witnessed, and that silence would soon become part of the mystery itself. When stories of disappearances on the Devil's Backbone began to spread, many expected authorities to sound alarms, restrict access, or, at the very least, acknowledge the growing concern. Instead, official voices remained curiously subdued. Reports were filed, searches were conducted, but once the immediate efforts ended, so did the conversations. Each case was explained away with phrases that became almost rehearsed. Likely misadventure, environmental hazards, unpredictable weather. It was as if the more mysterious the disappearances became, the more determined officials were to frame them as ordinary accidents. For families, this silence felt unbearable. They pushed for greater investigation, questioned why no warning signs were posted, and demanded answers that never arrived. Behind closed doors, some rescuers admitted the land was strange, but those words never reached the public. Official statements stayed polished, clinical, and dismissive of anything beyond the physical dangers of the trail. This silence left room for speculation. Was it simply bureaucracy refusing to indulge in folklore? Or was something more deliberate at play, a quiet effort to protect tourism, to avoid drawing attention to a place already gaining a reputation it couldn't shake? Whatever the reason, The lack of acknowledgement only fueled the trail's legend, creating a chasm between the official record and local whispers. And then came the case that broke the silence in its own way, not because of what was lost, but because, for once, someone came back. Their story didn't provide clarity. Instead, it blurred the line between nightmare and reality, forcing people to reconsider what might truly linger along the backbone. Disappearances on the Devil's Backbone usually end the same way: unanswered questions, grieving families, and case files stamped with the word inconclusive. But one incident stands apart. It didn't involve someone who vanished forever. It involved someone who returned. And what they carried back was a story that unsettled even the most skeptical investigators. In the summer of 2011, a hiker named Melissa Reynolds set out alone on the backbone. Melissa was no stranger to the outdoors. She'd spent years exploring trails across Colorado. Friends described her as grounded, practical, not prone to fear or exaggeration. She left in the morning with plans for a short, meditative hike. According to her watch and phone records, she made it a few miles in, texted a quick photo of the ridge to a friend, and then nothing. For 3 days, Melissa was missing. Search teams combed the area, bracing for the familiar tragedy of finding a body. But on the 4th day, she reappeared. A farmer spotted her wandering across a field nearly 10 miles from the trailhead. She was disoriented, her clothes torn, her lips cracked from dehydration, but she was alive. At first, Melissa couldn't speak about what had happened. Doctors attributed her confusion to exposure and exhaustion. But as she regained her strength, fragments of memory began to surface, and the details she shared only deepened the mystery. She remembered walking the trail as planned, enjoying the sound of the wind rushing through the ridges. Then she heard something else, a faint humming. Not music, exactly, but a vibration that seemed to pulse through the rocks. She stopped, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere. Melissa claimed the humming was followed by flickers of light along the ridge, like lanterns weaving between the rocks. At first, she thought it was another group of hikers, but as she watched, the lights didn't move naturally. They glided, she described, feeling drawn toward them, as if the trail itself shifted under her feet, guiding her closer. The next memory was fractured, darkness falling too quickly, her sense of direction unraveling, and the overwhelming certainty that someone or something was following her. She recalled waking up in places she didn't recognize, sometimes curled against the rocks, sometimes on patches of ground she didn't remember walking to. Time became slippery. Hours felt like minutes. Minutes felt like days. The most unsettling detail came when she spoke of voices. Melissa described hearing people calling her name, her mother's voice, her best friend's voice, even her own voice echoing from the ridge. But when she tried to follow, the trail twisted strangely, always leading her somewhere unfamiliar. It felt, she later said, like the backbone was rearranging itself, as if it didn't want me to leave. When asked how she eventually escaped, Melissa shook her head. She couldn't explain it. She remembered lying down near the rocks one evening, certain she would never get out. Then, without warning, she was standing in a field, the trail gone, the mountains distant. Doctors and investigators offered explanations. Hallucinations caused by dehydration, disorientation from heat, or psychological trauma from being lost. But those who knew Melissa argued otherwise. She was experienced, careful, and carried enough supplies for a short hike. More importantly, she remained haunted by her memories long after. "I can accept that I was dehydrated," she told Anne. Interviewer: "But dehydration doesn't make the land move. It doesn't put voices in your head that know your name." Melissa eventually moved away from Colorado. She rarely speaks of her experience now, but when she does, it's always with the same quiet warning. The backbone doesn't just take people. Sometimes it gives them back, but never the same. Her case became one of the few documented returns from a disappearance on the trail, but it offered no closure. Instead, it left investigators and locals more unsettled than before. Because if Melissa's memories held even a shred of truth, it suggested that the Devil's Backbone wasn't simply a dangerous hike. It was something else entirely, something that could decide who stayed, who vanished, and who was allowed to walk away. And as unsettling as her story was, it opened the door to even darker speculation about what might truly be happening along the ridges, and what other forces could be at work. When faced with mysteries that resist explanation, the human mind begins to weave theories, some grounded in logic, others spiraling into the unthinkable. The Devil's Backbone is no exception. Each disappearance, each unsettling encounter, has given rise to a spectrum of explanations, ranging from the practical to the paranormal. The simplest theory points to the land itself. The trail winds through sharp ridges, hidden drop-offs, and rocky terrain where one wrong step can mean disaster. Sudden storms, rattlesnakes, and dehydration could easily turn a routine hike into tragedy. According to officials, this is the most reasonable explanation. Nature doesn't need to be supernatural to be deadly. And yet, if it were only the land, why were so many cases devoid of evidence? No bodies, no gear, no trace. Another theory suggests human danger. Some whisper about criminals or reclusive groups using the ridges as cover, ambushing hikers who wandered too close. There have been reports, rarely publicized, of strange campsites, deep off-trail charred fire pits, remnants of rituals, bones of animals arranged in deliberate patterns. While there's no proof of organized cult activity, the idea lingers. Perhaps people vanish not because of the land, but because of others hiding within it. And then there are the theories that reach beyond the tangible. Paranormal enthusiasts believe the backbone sits on a fault in reality, a place where the boundary between worlds grows thin. They point to Melissa Reynolds' story, her memories of lights, voices, and shifting paths as evidence that the trail itself manipulates those who enter. Some describe it as a portal, others as a sentient force feeding on those who walk it. Skeptics scoff at such claims, but the weight of overlapping stories cannot be ignored. How do so many unrelated hikers describe whispers, footsteps, or lights in the rocks? How do experienced outdoorsmen vanish without leaving behind a single trace? In the end, the truth may never be pinned to one theory. Each explanation holds pieces of possibility, yet none can close the case entirely. The Devil's Backbone remains a puzzle, part natural hazard, part human shadow, and perhaps part something older, something beyond comprehension. What chills people most isn't which theory is true, but that any of them could be. Because no matter how the stories are explained, the fact remains. People keep vanishing, and the trail keeps its silence. And when patterns begin to surface in those vanishings, the mystery only deepens. Disappearances on the Devil's Backbone might seem random at first glance, scattered across decades like tragic but unrelated accidents. But when researchers, locals, and curious investigators began piecing together the dates, seasons, and circumstances, unsettling patterns started to emerge, patterns that made it difficult to dismiss these cases as coincidence. The first clue lies in timing. Many vanishings occur during transitional months, late spring and early fall, when the weather is unpredictable. Locals noticed that sudden storms often rolled through just before or during a disappearance. These weren't ordinary showers, but abrupt shifts where skies darkened without warning. Wind roared through the ridges, and the air felt charged, almost electric. It was as though the land itself used the storm as cover, masking whatever truly unfolded. Another layer is location. While the backbone spans miles, the majority of missing persons reports clustered near the higher ridges and narrow passes where the rocks form jagged corridors. Experienced searchers noticed that dogs often hesitated in these areas, whining or refusing to proceed. Some even described it as a dead zone, where sound behaved strangely, voices didn't carry right, and echoes seemed to come from directions that didn't exist. The timeline also reveals an eerie rhythm. Roughly every 3 to 5 years, a case emerges that gains public attention. A hiker, a group, or a solitary traveler who fails to return. In between, there are whispers of smaller incidents. Hikers who vanish briefly, only to reappear disoriented. Campers who wake convinced they were moved during the night. It's as if the trail feeds in cycles, resting only to return hungrier. Perhaps the most haunting detail is the recurrence of sensory reports. Survivors, near misses, and witnesses consistently describe similar phenomena. Voices calling their names, lights weaving across the ridges, and footsteps trailing them. When compiled together, these testimonies form a chilling pattern. Different people, different years, same experiences, almost as if rehearsed by the land itself. Skeptics point to confirmation bias. They argue that once stories spread, others simply interpret natural sounds or exhaustion through that lens. But those who've spent their lives near the backbone disagree. They'll tell you these details predate the internet, predate the folklore being widely known. It's not that people hear the stories and then experience them, one local said. It's that people experience them and then the stories spread. When researchers mapped out the cases by season and lunar cycles, another pattern emerged. Several disappearances occurred near new moons, when the sky was darkest. Others clustered around solstices, dates long tied to ritual and myth. Whether this is coincidence or something older, woven into the land's rhythm, no one can say for certain. The deeper you look, the more the pattern feels less like accident and more like intention. Like the trail chooses its moments, its people, and its silence. And that thought lingers long after the maps and timelines are put away. If the backbone's history really does follow a rhythm, then the cycle hasn't ended. Which means somewhere out there, it may already be waiting for the next traveler to step into its pattern, unaware of what watches from the ridges above. Because on the Devil's Backbone, the most unsettling truth isn't just that people vanish. It's that the vanishings don't happen at random. They happen with purpose. And if the pattern holds, it isn't finished yet. The devil's backbone is a place of contradiction. In daylight, it is breathtaking sunlight carving golden edges into the ridges, wildflowers pushing through cracks in the stone, hikers pausing to marvel at the horizon. But beneath its beauty lies a shadow, a history written not in guidebooks, but in names on missing persons lists, in families who never received answers, and in stories whispered by those who felt something watching them along the path. What makes this trail so unsettling is not only the number of people who have disappeared, but the way it refuses to explain itself. Every search ends the same weight races that lead nowhere, belongings abandoned neatly, and silence stretching across the cliffs. And in that silence, imaginations run wild. Some say the land is alive, others that it hides a portal, or that something ancient lingers among the rocks, waiting for those who stray too far. But perhaps what truly haunts us is the lack of closure. We crave explanations, even frightening ones, because they give us control. The devil's backbone denies us that comfort. It offers only fragment slights on the ridges, whispers in the wind, and stories of people stepping forward one moment and vanishing the next. So, the question lingers. Would you walk the backbone knowing what you know now? Could you ignore the whispers, the shadows, the pull of the unknown? Or would you, like so many before, feel that quiet urge to step just a little further, to chase what waits beyond the ridge? Whether you see it as legend, curse, or simply the danger of untamed wilderness, the devil's backbone remains what it has always been, a trail that watches. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you'll hear it whispering still.